I think leadership's important. I don't think it's nearly as important as we make it, because every time we say leader, we think of an individual. Even if you use the word leadership to refer to somebody in the factory who came up with a good idea, you're always focusing on the individual. Leadership means individual. Of course, leadership is portrayed as the individual motivating and encouraging and empowering and all these nice words for everybody else. But the focus is still on the individual. And I think I like to use a word community-ship that you won't find in the dictionary, but you'll find it in print here and there. And I kind of coined it about 10 or 15 years ago or a little more to contrast with leadership and to realize that there's something called community-ship, which in a way is more important than leadership because it's about people engaging. If you look at what's going on in Europe now, with regard to the refugees, there's a kind of groundswell of communityship where people are saying, we just got to do something about this. As opposed to the leadership in Hungary and some other countries, or in our own country, for that matter. Our own prime minister has said there could be terrorists, so we can't let anybody in, which isn't quite right. We're going to let 10,000 people in over the next 4 years, so please be patient while we get to it. That's our prime minister's stand. He just fired in the middle of an election his campaign manager, or at least he sent her home because he's always blaming someone else. So he's blaming her for his problems right now. And the Canadians understand. The Danes understand too. So I want to disrupt you a little bit for starters. I'm sort of tempted to redo the tables, but that would be chaos. So I just want to slightly balance the tables. I just want to ask who is, number one, primarily a user of coaching ourselves? In other words, you're here primarily as users. Okay, so there's, two at that table, so that's okay. How many are here as coaches relating to the use of coaching ourselves or the promotion of coaching ourselves or the sort of, wait, how many at that table? I just want to, there's three, just want to sort of maybe balance a little bit. If when we're done, a couple of you could move around a bit so we don't have, unless you prefer, maybe we'll leave it alone. Maybe you prefer to share your experience. It's just that we'd like you to share your experience with other people too. How many of you are here primarily as HR people? Okay, and how many are here as academics or authors? Okay. And finally, this is the important question for balancing. How many of you are here who haven't really used coaching ourselves but are interested? So I just want to make sure there aren't too many. Keep your hands up for a sec. Okay, just want to make sure there's not too many at any. There's quite a few at that table. Can you? Now, I don't know. Maybe you could just switch a couple. How many at this table? Who are primarily who haven't particularly used it? None? Maybe one or two of you could just switch with one or two of you. So the idea is to indoctrinate all of you with people who have, but really to share experience, not so much to indoctrinate. Okay, so I have been sort of involved with management, teaching of management, writing about management, worrying about management, and organizations for a long, long time. It goes back to a previous century, in fact, which isn't, I guess most of us go back, I hope all of us go back to a previous century, otherwise you're 15 years old. And what are you doing here? You must be at that table or something. And I've always been concerned with a kind of an approach to organizing, an approach to managing that I always thought was dysfunctional compared to one that is more functional. And I'll get to some of that more directly at the end, but my concern has always been a very top-down, leader-centric, rather bureaucratic, although nobody would recognize it or accept it as that, but it's kind of a detached, much more evidence-based management instead of experience evidence-based management. By evidence-based management, I mean, for example, people who read financial statements and think that's how you run a company. All of that has always been a concern to me, and my career has been so successful that there is much more of it now than ever before. So either nobody's been listening or I staunched a little bit of the tide. But I think we've moved more and more in that direction. And I think internet is a contributor to that in a way, because it's a wonderful, I'm thinking mostly of email, but it's a wonderful thing. But everybody is so distracted and so pressured and so kind of pushed to do faster, 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 that there's much less thoughtfulness going on in the world. And I think we desperately need more thoughtfulness. We need more stepping back, which we're doing here for a couple of days, and just sort of reflecting on what's going on. In 1996, well, a few years before, around 1994, 1993, I was going around giving sort of what I called my flagellation speeches at business schools, where I'd tell them that MBA programs are not the answer and they're dysfunctional and they better do something about their MBA programs. And as you can see, that's been a huge success as well. I don't mean just that they're MBA programs, but I mean that MBA programs are fundamentally unchanged. There's all kinds of new courses in leadership and ethics and morality, and the famous schools have an oath that you're supposed to sign, promising to be good. Killing of Enron, I'm sure when he was an MBA student would have signed that in a flash before he went to jail. And my concern was part of that same whole issue, which is that we're training managers who are detached, who think they can manage anything because they sat still in a business school for a couple of years, and so on and so forth. So I went around bad-mouthing MBA programs, and people started asking a question which you must never ask of an academic. It's just not fair, which is, what are you doing about it? And our job is not to do anything about anything. Our job is to complain. So why should anybody, ask me to do something about it? Anyway, eventually we got embarrassed enough and started to create new ways of thinking about management education and management development, but really the two married together, so that management education was and could become management development. Because management education, traditionally the MBA, is not about management development, because the people sitting there are not managers. They're people who want to be managers, but they're not managers. So we had to combine those two. And we started off pretty naively. A woman named Nancy Bedore, who had created a very famous executive development program at Ford with lots of wonderful creative ideas, was kind of helping us as we went along. So I'd call Nancy once in a while and say, how about this, and what should we do about that, and so on and so forth. And at one point Nancy said, so how are you going to seat them? And I said, I guess in one of those U-shaped classrooms, like a case study classroom. And she said, not those obstetric stirrups. It's quite a kind of graphic. If your English is not quite that good, it's what women are kind of wear as they give birth, kind of holds their legs apart so they can give birth. And so it got us thinking, and we ended up doing this way. In all our classes and all our programs, and Coaching Ourselves logo is all about the round tables. Everything's about the round tables. And it's the idea that these are groups of equals who share, and everybody can learn from everybody else, and there's not somebody kind of, sort of necessarily the boss kind of role. And but that's where we were at the beginning, and then we started to do things, and our opening belief was that you don't create a manager in a classroom. You create hubris in a classroom where people are sitting there who've never managed and think they can learn management, because management is not a profession. There's no credentials to become managers, and the MBA is certainly not a credential. And managers are not, management is not a science the way medicine is, or at least I wouldn't say medicine is a science. I would say medicine uses a lot of science, but management doesn't use that much science compared to medicine or engineering. Management is a practice. It's a practice, which means it's significantly experience-based. There's evidence, and we should use it where we can and understand what we can, but management is significantly a practice which is experience-based. And so, right from the start, the idea was you come into that classroom because you're a manager. You don't come in to become a manager. You come in because you are a manager, number one, and number two, you learn from experience by reflecting on your own experience as a manager and sharing it around the tables with other managers. And so we have, for example, something called the 50-50 rule, which is half the time over to the people in the room on their agendas. So half the time it's us, kind of what I'm doing now, and half the time, which is more evidence-based in a way, because we're talking about theories and research and all that kind of stuff, but half the time it's over to the managers on their agendas. So there's a kind of balance between evidence, more evidence-based coming from faculty and more experience-based coming from people there, and that's exactly what's going on here now. You have a lot of experience. And so coaching ourselves, as I'll talk about later, grew out of the original program. The original program was called the IMPM, the International Masters in Practicing Management, and then the healthcare version followed, called the International Masters for Health Leadership, and coaching ourselves followed that in the sense, and I'll tell you why later, but in the sense of going from what happens in the classroom or in a room like this, taking it back and embedding it in the workplace. And then, instead of having experienced colleagues around the table who come from all different places, as we do here, which is still good for sharing, because you're sharing from one company to another, and from one experience to another, and from being a consultant to being a user, and so on and so forth. But by carrying it back into the workplace, you've got groups that are working together all the time. So people sitting around, like now with a couple of his colleagues, people sitting around are sharing their own experience, their own collective experience, and they're getting inputs about dealing with silos in organizations, or formulating strategy, or dealing with blind spots, or whatever it is. But they're looking at that and, all right, how are we doing that? What's happening here? Are we really good? There's a topic called Beyond Bickering. Bickering is kind of when people complain to each other all the time. And you get a group that works together doing a topic called Beyond Bickering, and suddenly it becomes kind of, hey, wait a minute, we do a lot of bickering in this place, we could stop it. So it becomes extremely powerful. Anyway, that message has been so compelling that there's been no change that I can perceive much in business schools, but there is change in practice, and this conference is an indication of that. Okay, so various opening comments. These are some pictures I took off the Harvard Executive Program website. This is not the MBA, this is the Executive Program website. And seriously, at that point, it was some years ago, every picture, I call it getting the Harvard finger. There was obviously some photographer who liked this kind of image, or whoever selected the pictures. And you'll notice a couple of things about it. If you look at the people in the back, they're clearly sort of middle to senior managers, right? But they're out of focus. And what's in focus is the professor with the finger. And that's kind of represents, this is management development. This is not management education. It's hardly better in management education. Of course, whoever chose these photographs knew full well that they were in a case study classroom, and they were in fact engaging in a lot of discussion. these people, but about what? About other people's experience. And you can certainly learn from other people's experience. But what do you really know about having read a case the night before that's 10 pages long, 20 pages long at the most, and suddenly what should the company do, or more likely, what should the chief executive do? And what kind of a manager does that create when you're going through dozens of cases in a program like this, or hundreds of cases in a degree program, and you're constantly jumping from one company to another, and you're constantly pronouncing on companies you know almost nothing about, or really nothing about. This was taken in one of our programs, actually our healthcare program. And if we're here to talk about it, there's been a lot of discussion. Yesterday we had a prior event. I apologize for some of this talk repeating, but actually it's better when you hear it the second time, so I'll do it again tonight. But this is what I think of as next generation. These are very experienced people in healthcare. One of them was the head administrator of a hospital. One of them ran a region in Quebec healthcare, and the guy in the middle is a professor at the University of Oregon who was there with our blessing to take what we were doing and copy it and bring it back to his own program in Oregon. And highly experienced, and they have something to bring to those tables, and it's very powerful stuff. So that's I talked about the origin of the IMPM, the International Masters in Practicing Management, and to kind of make people more aware of it, we decided we'd also brand it as the managers, should the S apostrophe, the managers EMBA, small EMBA, meaning not executive masters of business administration, but engaging managers beyond administration. And that's kind of what we're thinking of as EMBA. Engaging managers beyond administration, kind of rethinking the whole idea. Even the name executive. You ever met an executive in an executive MBA program? You know, it's there's a vocabulary that is really questionable. Okay, I said this already. You can't create a manager in a classroom, but you can enhance the qualities of people who are already practicing it, and this is best done by leveraging their experience. Okay, I talked about that. Now it won't go anywhere. Oh, there we go. We have a motto that says use work, not make work. People who are coming to these programs are obviously very busy if they're managers, and they're more busy by the fact that before they came, they had to do extra work because they're going to be away. These programs run in modules of 10 or 11 days each every 4 months. So over the course of a year and a half, they're doing 5 modules. In the business program, those go around the world at top schools in England and Montreal and Bangalore and Beijing and Rio de Janeiro. In the healthcare program, they're mostly in Montreal, but the people in the program are from everywhere, from all over the world. So they're busy. Having come to the program, they're going to be even busier when they get back to work to catch up on things. And they're constantly slipping out at coffee breaks to make 16 email, or phone calls, and so on and so forth. One of the most famous entrepreneurs in India in the airline business bought his first helicopter at a coffee break in Montreal in the program. So that's the kind of thing that happens. So we try to use work as much as possible. So they've got to do things. We want them to write papers at the end of every module, back at work, of kind of what they learned at the module, but the idea of those papers is to connect what happened at the module with what's going on at work. So we're always trying to use work, and of course in the classroom we're doing all kinds of things to use the work that they do naturally. The most interesting part of that, and Jonathan Gosling, who's hiding somewhere here, way back there, developed this idea that's called friendly consulting, where each one, individuals in the class have a particular issue that they're struggling with, and they get together in a small room during the program with 4 or 5 of their colleagues and go through a whole process of being helped to think through that problem. or that opportunity. And it could be something very mundane, like this product isn't selling, or it could be something personal, like I really can't take what's going on in my company, should I quit? Or whatever it is. And they're helped by their colleagues, and later they'll be helping their colleagues, so everybody gets a chance to do this. They absolutely love that. They absolutely love that. It's a huge high point for everybody. And again, it's using work. It's using the problems and the concerns of work. 50-50 rule I discussed, reflecting on experience. Every morning we open our programs, and if you've done coaching ourselves, you know about the happenings being the first thing. The equivalent in these programs is called morning reflections. It's a 3-stage process. By the way, I have to say, the whole philosophy here is learning as you go along, not only in the design of things, but in our classrooms are incredibly animated, and ideas are constantly coming up, and they're not just coming up from us as faculty, but people in the room. I'll tell you a story about that later. People in the room are coming up with all kinds of ideas, and we're constantly doing new things. So, lovely quote here. Experience is not what happens to you, it's what do you do with what happens to you. There's another quote from Saul Alinsky, the sort of famous activist, who says, I think it was him who said, most people go through life having happenings. Happenings become experience when you reflect on them and learn from them. So that's how experience comes. I mentioned some of these things, friendly, just some of the ideas we use, friendly consulting. I mentioned dedicated tables. What we're doing now is saying to people like entrepreneurs, we have always some entrepreneurs in the class. Sometimes we will group them together so they can learn and discuss their own problems, because the financing problems for entrepreneurs or the marketing problems for new enterprises may be quite different from those for established enterprises. So some of that seating time is for them. Impact teams, I won't go into it in much detail, but we can discuss if there are questions. Impact teams is the idea that, there's an old saying, never send a changed person back to an unchanged organization. Have any of you ever done anything but that if you're in management training? When has a changed person been sent back to a changed organization? It just doesn't happen, which means the impact of you're going back and your colleagues are going to say either, wow, I can't wait to hear what you've done, this is going to be so interesting, or yeah, while you were eating that good food in Montreal, we were filling in for you, and all that kind of stuff. So we took the kind of bull by the horns, if you like, and said, we would like people in our program to designate impact teams, to designate teams back at work of colleagues or people close to you, and go back and debrief them. They'll be waiting to hear what you have done. You debrief them, and then you start talking about what can we do to make use of this. We even use coaching ourselves topics in those teams, because if I give a lecture in the program on emergent strategy, there's a topic on crafting strategy that's about that, and they can say, you want to hear what Mintzberg said about strategy? Here's a coaching ourselves topic, and we can do it, and you'll be part of what they did. So it can become quite powerful as a way to change that dynamic. So you're going back into an organization that you're changing as a consequence of how you're viewing your role to go back. Not just to go back and say it was great, but to do something about it. Fully customized, the 50-50 rule and all that means a lot of customization, the famous 70%. Now look at the current state of management development. This is truly shocking. And this is a quote about an executive MBA program. In fact, one of the most famous executive MBA programs in the world, it's at Wharton. And this kind of comment has been up on their website since at least 2002, when I published a book called Managers Not MBAs in 2004. I had a quote from their website was even stronger than this. And listen to what it says. This is a current version. The Wharton MBA for Executives gives you an undiluted MBA, the same degree, same innovative curriculum, same faculty as offered in a full-time Wharton MBA program. What they're doing is boasting that they do no more for people with experience than for people who have no experience. Most MBAs have little or no managerial experience. And they're boasting that they're doing the same thing for people who are coming in with experience. It's quite shocking. And it just sits on their website like that. And kind of nobody picks it up. Like, wait a minute, hold on. You want me to go to a program where of course, if I'm going to the program to get a big job on Wall Street in finance, and of course, I want all Wharton's power of finance. And Wharton is, most business schools are very good at the management functions, like finance and marketing. Very good at that. But that's not management. Managers need to understand finance. Managers need to use marketing. Of course, it's all part of it. But that's not managing. That's not managing. They don't teach. They don't teach managing, or else they teach it through cases. And I'll get to that in a moment. So this is the state of management education still. This one, I think, is a bit more shocking. This is an ad that's been running in The Economist for the Harvard Business School executive education, not MBA. Harvard has no EMBA. For regular MBA, and she's saying, we studied 4 companies a day. This isn't theory. This is experience. This is nonsense. This is sheer, undiluted nonsense. 4 cases a day is experience? What does she know about those companies? What do any of those people in that class know about those companies? Really. But this is George Bush type MBA education. Give me a case on Iraq and I'll give you a war. That's I doubt if he read a case on Iraq. Now, inside. Okay, communityship for me is the key. Communityship is the single thing that bonds all this together. For one thing, our tables are communities, especially when we have dedicated tables. If we have 5 entrepreneurs sitting at this table in one of these programs, and they're some of that 50%, let's say half the 50%, a quarter of class time, is dedicated to them sharing their problems as entrepreneurs, they become a community, and very strong. The class becomes a community. The bonding in the class is extraordinary. Let me tell you a story, the one we're most proud of in the healthcare program. 2-3 years ago, a woman named Joanne Lieu was in the program. She was an emergency room physician at a children's hospital here in Montreal, and the name will mean something to you in a minute. She was who had volunteered over the years for Doctors Without Borders in various trouble spots. Because of the confidence she felt she gained in the classroom, she decided to run for the worldwide presidency of Doctors Without Borders. And here's where the community feeling comes in. Her colleagues in the classroom volunteered to form her campaign committee. And so they got together and formed her campaign committee. She is now the president of Doctors Without Borders worldwide. But the story doesn't stop there, because she became the #1 player in the Ebola crisis. And anyone who knows will acknowledge that. So much so that Fortune magazine had a list of the 50 most famous people in the world, and well, not most famous, but most effective people in the world. And within less than a year of taking her position, she was #7 on that list. Why? Because it's all wrapped up with all the things we're doing in all these programs. On the ground, know what's going on, be engaged as a manager, and so on. Doctors Without Borders knew what was happening in those small villages in those 3 countries where the Ebola crisis broke out. They were there. The World Health Organization was not there. The representatives of the World Health Organizations, who were kind of political type appointments, were sitting in the capitals of those 3 countries. They didn't know what was going on the ground. There's the contrast sort of between 2 styles of organizing. She knew that Doctors Without Borders would not wake the world up alone. So she met the head of the WHO and lobbied very hard for them to acknowledge it and announce it as a worldwide crisis. And that probably saved millions and millions of lives. Joanne ended up addressing the Security Council of the United Nations and so on. It comes out of a style of management that's connected, that's attached, that knows what's going on, that understands a sense of community, that understands their own organization. Joanne had been volunteering for Doctors Without Borders for years, and so on and so forth. So organizations are communities of human beings. They're not collections of human resources. I realize a number of you hold jobs called human resources, and I don't blame you for that. It's not a nice term. I'm not a human resource, I'm a human being. And I'm not a human asset, and I'm not human capital. We use this vocabulary mindlessly. We don't even think about it. People say, what can we do instead? I say, well, personnel wasn't that bad. or just call it the people department, the human being department. How about that? Community is built through an engaged management that cares, not a heroic leadership that cures. We've got this 100-day or 1,000-day chief executive comes in, and in 100 days we're going to change this place completely. It's a good way of pronouncing on upcoming failure. And all this kind of heroic sort of the individual's going to come in. The very fact that anybody would accept to be paid 400 times as much as the workers in his or her own company is a sign of absence of leadership. Nobody who accepts to be paid that way and in effect is saying, I'm 400 times more important than you are, should be called a leader. No one. It's not about what they earn. They don't even have time to spend it. It's just mine is bigger than yours. It's keeping score. But if you really want to be a leader, if you really want to exercise leadership in a company, then you build communityship. And the last way to do it is by accepting these obscene pay systems. Instead of programs that create tomorrow's leaders, we need initiatives that commit today's managers. So it's not we're creating the leaders of the future because we teach wonderful theory or because we've got great cases. It's a question of engaging. It's a question of engaging people to act now, and that's what the programs are like, and coaching ourselves even more so, because coaching ourselves ends its 90-minute session always with, okay, what are you doing right now? Sometimes even on your way to the office, on your way back to your own office, what are you going to be doing? It's always about what are you going to be doing now? No promises, please. What are you going to be doing now? I love this one. This was an ad for SAP, the software company, SAP Canada. It says, this is not a cow. This is an organization chart that shows the different parts. You know the painting, this is not a pipe, shows a pipe, and it's the reason is because it's not a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe. So this is an organization chart that shows the different parts of a cow. In a real cow, the parts aren't aware that they're parts. They don't have trouble sharing information. They smoothly and naturally work together as one unit, as a cow. And you have only one question to answer. Do you want your organization to work like a chart or a cow? That is a deadly serious question. That is a really important question. How do you want your organization to work? Now, each of us, if we're healthy, work like a cow too, right? My heart and my brain's not in charge. Somehow my heart, my lungs, my kidneys, they all kind of coordinate and communicate with each other through blood flowing, that's the resources, through nerves, that's the information system, and so on. There's just a kind of natural flow, and so on. How come we can't get our organizations? As soon as we get a bunch of cows probably work okay, compared with cats. But how do we get a bunch of human beings, each of whom works like a cow, or works, functionally, to work together? If you can solve that problem, if you can get closer to that problem, you've made a big difference in your organization or the organizations you work with. And that's key. And that's what these programs are really all about. That's what communityship is about. Now here I got another one for you, because this one's working like a cow, and this one is walking like a cow. And this is really fun. This is a real event. As I mentioned, the IMPM runs one of its modules in Bangalore, in India. And the whole class was out, most of whom weren't from India, but we have people from all over the world. And they had to get across the street, and they were being taken around Bangalore on the opening day to kind of show them Bangalore and what's going on. And it's kind of like, how in the world do we get across this street? And the guy who was taking them said, it's easy, we walk like a cow. And what did he mean? He said, the drivers are used to cows ambling across the street. They have a destination, they're going across the street, but they're ambling slowly, and they're one big cow, and you don't want to hit a big cow for two reasons. One thing, you'll get lynched, but the other thing is that you'll damage your vehicle and so on. So all we have to do is gather together, all together, and we will move across the street like a cow. And what a wonderful metaphor it is for an organization working functionally. What a wonderful metaphor it is. So one of the participants, Mike Fitzgerald, VP Global HR at CEPID Inc., wrote an article. One of our students, we don't say students, we say participants, wrote an article in The Economist. This is a photograph from the article. It was actually in the electronic part of it. You can access it. I'm an executive at the corporate headquarters of an American company. The mindset, I didn't mention this earlier, but the 5 modules are not organized around the business functions like marketing and finance and all that. They're organized around managerial mindsets. So the first one held in England is called the reflective mindset, and it's about managing yourself. The second one is held in Canada, Montreal. It's called the analytic mindset, and it's mostly about managing organizations. The third one in Bangalore is called the worldly mindset, and it's about managing the context around the organization. I'll come back to that in a minute. The fourth one that's held in Beijing, in China, is called the collaborative mindset, and it's about managing relationships. And the fifth one is called the action mindset, managing change, and that's held in Rio de Janeiro. So the whole program is organized around how managers think and how managers face things. Now the third one, we decided to call it the worldly mindset and not the global mindset, because global to us sounds like cookie cutter, the same. It sounds like we're trying to make everybody the same. Worldly means to understand other people's worlds in order to understand your own. You know, T.S. Eliot, we shall never cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to return where we started and know the place for the first time. That's the worldly mindset. Go to India not because you just want to learn about India, which is an interesting country. Go to India because it is a place that blows the mind of anybody who's not from India. To me, it is the most different place on earth that I've ever encountered. And to understand that, one woman, in the very first time we went there, I wanted everybody to come in from the airport on auto rickshaws, about 45-minute drive to where we were going, and you're laughing because you can understand. And my Indian colleague says, Henry, there is no way they're coming in on auto rickshaws. So, okay, all right. So we came in an ambassador. I came in an ambassador car with a bunch of the people, and that's sort of the closest thing to a Sherman tank. You know, the steel on the ambassador cars, about like that. And she was looking out the window and absolutely freaking out. If she was in an auto rickshaw, she would never have made it. She would have turned around and gone home. But she's an American woman working for Lufthansa. And a few days later, she says to one of the professors, how do you function in this traffic? Like, how can you deal with it? And he just looks at her and says, we join the flow. And suddenly, there's worldly learning. You mean that's not chaos out there? You mean there's logic to what's going on? And of course, walking like a cow is part of that, right? There's a logic for getting across the street that you would never dream of. Can you imagine people in Montreal walking into the traffic in a big group? They'd knock them all over. So anyway, the worldly mindset has encouraged me to reflect and challenge my ingrained assumptions and to adopt a worldly mindset when I deal with colleagues in various countries. So that's the whole purpose, is to do that. I never know which one to hit. This is going to fail at some point. Okay, so two models of development in a classroom or in a room like this, okay? Model one is you're parachuted in as an individual. Everything's about the individual, especially if it's leadership training, you're there as an individual. Even if it's not leadership training, you're there as an individual and you're sitting in a row and you're being educated. You're being taught. The model here, model two is you're there as a representative of a development community. You're not there as an individual. You're there on behalf of your organization to make a change in how your organization functions. It's not just about training you. Of course you want individuals to come back better. But it's about how you're going to change your organization. And of course, if all 5 of you around this table are from that company, then or organization, whatever it is, municipality, whatever, if all 5 of you are from the same one, then that becomes much more powerful. And then if you pick up that table and take it out of the classroom and put it in your organization in the form of a coaching ourselves exercise, think of how much more powerful that is. So this is really a kind of almost kind of revolutionary change in how we conceive management education and management development or management development. Now, I'm not saying other people don't do this kind of thing. Of course they do. Lots of people do it. And it's more prevalent in executive, not just executive, but management development programs than it is in just university programs. But there's still a lot of that other thing going on. All right, let me say a little bit about kind of a different way of conceiving management. This, you probably know this, John Cotter's model of change, probably the best known model of changing an organization. Read through all that. Establishing a sense of urgency. Who? Forming a powerful guiding coalition. Who? Creating a vision. Who does that? Communicating the vision. Who does that? Empowering others to act on the vision. Who does that? Planning for and creating short-term wins. Who does that? Consolidating, improving, and producing still more change. More. Institutionalizing new approaches. Again, it's all about so-called top management. It's every step of the way is as if nobody exists in that organization except so-called top management. We're obsessed with this. We're obsessed with this. It's as if nobody else, there's no community, there's no sense of anything else. There's just the great one who's going to do it all. And sometimes it works. And most of the time it fails. Let me give you an example that's quite shocking. In 1990, a book was written about the Harvard Business School by an insider, and it was very, very, very complimentary to Harvard. On about page 6, there was a list of Harvard superstars as of 1990. Its most successful graduates as chief executives of businesses, 19 of them. I looked at that book earlier, but I looked at it again in 2003. And there on that list was, what's his name? A guy who almost destroyed 3 different airlines. Lorenzo? Yeah, Frank Lorenzo. Frank Lorenzo was on that list. I thought, gee, happened after 1990, obviously. So we took all 19 people on that list, and we studied them very, very, very carefully over those 13 years, from 1990 to 2003. And guess what? 10 of them were total failures. Total. I mean, the company went bankrupt. They were fired by the board. 10 of them. 4 were on the margin, questionable. Maybe okay, maybe not. And 5 of them were successful. What's his name at IBM? Gerstner was one of the 5. He was at American Express at that point. He was one of the 5 who seemed to have a successful career. But 10 or 14 out of 19. Now, you look at that. We didn't hide those results. They were published in a Fortune magazine article, and then I published them in my book, Managers Not MBAs, which sold quite a few copies, even if nobody read it. And you sort of look at that and you say, whoa, wait a minute. Whoa, this is not definitive proof. It's one little study, but it sure should raise a lot of alarm bells. Zero. Nothing. So people should have said, at Harvard, for example, they could have said, this guy's wrong, we'll show he's wrong, which would be perfectly fine if they could do that. Or other people would say, gee, we better follow this up and see what's going on. Nothing. Zero. Zero. Nothing. The only study I know of the success or failure of chief executives who have MBAs from Harvard. It's the only study I know. So that's where we are today. And I think it's largely because of this obsession with a single individual. So let me do this comparison of heroic leadership with engaging management, okay? On one side, leaders are important people, quite apart from others who develop products and deliver services. Or managers are important to the extent they help other people to be important. Notice that I'm violating this very popular notion that leaders are different from managers. Okay, that somehow some people are leaders who do the right things and other people are managers who do things right. Well, try doing the right things without doing them right. Would you like to be managed by somebody who's not a leader? Probably not. Well, would you like to be led by somebody who's not a manager? They won't know what's going on. They haven't rolled up their sleeves. They don't know what's going on the ground. The stories we love are Jack Welch getting under a machine and finding out what the problems are. Those are the stories we love. We love managers who have dirt under their fingernails, who know what's going on, who don't sit in offices and read annual reports, or annual reports, daily reports, I guess, quarterly reports. If I keep hitting this on. The higher up these leaders go, the more important they become. At the top, the CEO is the corporation. What top? What's top about top management? Tell me what's top about top management. The salary, the floor of the building, probably. They're on the top floor. But you know what? The highest chief executive of an American company in New York City who's sitting on a 80th or 90th floor is lower than the lowest clerk in Denver, Colorado, who's sitting at 5,000 feet above sea level. Okay, so what's top about, and you know this English expression, to be on top of things? If you see yourself on top of the organization, does that help you to be on top of things when the organization's down there instead of here? An organization is an interacting network, not a vertical hierarchy. Effective managers work throughout, they don't sit on top. Down the hierarchy comes the strategy, clear, deliberate, and bold, emanating from the chief executive who takes dramatic acts. Everyone else implements. And then, of course, when implementation fails, when the strategy fails, implementation gets blamed because it's usually the formulators who are doing the blaming. You know, we had a beautiful strategy and you idiots were not smart enough to implement it. Well, if the idiots were smart, they would turn around and say, well, why didn't you formulate strategies that we idiots were capable of implementing? So every failure of formulation of implementation is a failure of formulation. Okay? So that game needs to stop. Out of the network emerge strategies as engaged people solve little problems that grow into big initiatives. One of the most successful companies in the world is IKEA. Okay? And IKEA, and the heart and soul of IKEA's strategy is to sell furniture unassembled so you can take it home in your car. And it saves them money, it saves you money, everybody's happy, and so on and so forth. Wonderful idea. It didn't come from a bunch of executives sitting in an office. It came from a worker. This is off their own website. It came from a worker who had to get a table in his car and couldn't, so he took the legs off. And then the critical moment came where somebody said, hey, wait a minute, if we have to take the legs off, so do our customers. That's not genius, but it changed the furniture business. That's where really interesting strategies come from, not from this top-down, you know, vision and mission and all this silliness. To lead is to make decisions and allocate resources, including those human resources. Leading thus means calculating based on facts from reports. In other words, evidence. To manage is to bring out the energy that exists naturally within people. Managing thus means engaging based on judgment rooted in context. Very different model. Finally, leadership is thrust upon those who thrust their will on others, or leadership is a sacred trust earned from the respect of others. You become a leader from the people who believe in your leadership. You don't become a leader because some board who barely knows what you're doing as a manager appoints you. Okay, so it's a very, very different view. Okay, let me finish with a story just briefly. How are we doing for time, Phil? We're okay. Let me finish with a story of coaching ourselves. And our original ideas sought to merge management education with management development. And then Phil came along and added embedded development. And that was really a huge, fascinating change. The story is very simple. I knew Phil years ago. He was the engineering manager of a local branch of a high-tech company. He came to me one day and he says, my managers are struggling. I don't have budget from HR. I've got to do something with them. And Phil always says that before I said that, I said, read my book, Managers, Not MBAs. But anyway, after that, so I said, well, do what we do. It's very simple. Get them around the table once a week, once every couple of weeks, and discuss it. And by the way, here are the workbooks we use, and you can use some of these articles to circulate to them. Like, you want to do something on negotiating skills, here's a couple of articles about negotiating, and so on and so forth. And Phil started to do it, and the people in his group started to create their own groups. And we're kind of looking at this like, hey, wait a minute, we got something important going on here. So we created coachingourselves.com, and a kind of peer coaching thing. And I won't say more about that because you're going to be hearing lots about all these kinds of things. Let's just open it up for comments, arguments, questions, concerns, disagreements, agreement. No, don't bother with agreements, but anything that can advance this, or things that aren't clear, or you want to know more about something. So, questions, comments? Yeah.
Can I throw a couple of quite big challenges at you? Firstly, listening to you talk about leadership, if I go to your last point, statement 5, it's very nested in Weber's beliefs on power.
Very nested?
In Weber's beliefs on power.
Right.
Leadership has moved on.
Yeah.
Our understanding of power has moved on.
Yeah.
Look at Mark Steers, a colleague of mine at the University College at Oxford. He talks about the contributions of Arendt and Buber to philosophies of power. I just got this sense that we were getting exposed to something that had no theory neutrality in the language. Yeah. And I'm kind of left with this impression that you're almost anti-leadership.
No, I'm not anti-leadership at all. Look, I just did a book called Rebalancing Society, where I think the private sector has too much balance in society. If I was raised in Russia 50 years ago, I would have not been able to, but tried to write a book saying the public sector has too much power. That's not my perception. You should live in this country for a while with our current prime minister, who is a control freak and tries to manage everything himself and is very, very aggressive with regard to what he believes in. I go into company after company after company, and I see so much of this. I see people. I do a TWOG, a weekly blog. I call it a TWOG because from tweet to blog. You can find it on Twitter at Mintzberg141, or just go to mintzberg.org/blog. And I just did one on the prevalence. I referred to 4 stories that I had heard in a week about controlling managers who just tie people in knots. It is absolutely prevalent. Not that there aren't other people doing other things, but that my experience, yours is different, but my experience is it's absolutely pervasive and getting worse by the day. That's my belief. And I think a lot of it has to do with MBAs who think, whose companies think they need to manage and who think they need to be in charge without knowing what's going on. So it's a different perception, and it's fair enough, but yeah.
I'm trying to organize my thoughts. I have hoped to talk with you about this for many years now, and I think that the points that you're making about, for example, Cotter's top-down thing about executive compensation, about management compensation, or let's call it today managerial capitalism, etc. I think there's a titanic force at work here. For many years, I worked for an organization that did consulting around organizational design and organizational change, and there are models that codify the essence of Taylorism that are still used by 999 of the Fortune 1000 companies that evaluate jobs and thus provide the information necessary for pay grades and compensation practices and all sorts of other managerial practices that stem from these generic semantic definitions about how inputs, throughputs, and outputs work.
Right.
And until that is deeply changed, this stuff, which I fundamentally agree with, is going to be dissonant and very difficult because the fundamental core assumptions of work design based on specialization of labor, efficiency, focus, and so on are not changing, have not been changed.
Yep.
And this is deeply structural. I would argue that it affects most of what goes on in society, not only in management. And I'd be interested in knowing what you think about that, those deep structural aspects.
Yeah, I mean, I can't get into a lot of detail here now. We can chat about it, but for sure. The word is paradigm, that people sort of subscribe subconsciously to a way of viewing the world. If it was pre-Einstein, the paradigm was Newtonian physics, and then Einstein came along and changed that. But people are locked into a mental set and can't see past it. And it's so ingrained. And when does a paradigm change? When another theory comes along that can replace it, or when things become so bad that people just rise up and say, we've got to do things differently. And of course, they need something to go to. They can't go to nothing. They can't go from what they're doing to nothing. They've got to go to something else. So, yeah, I agree with you completely. I think it's a kind of disease, yeah.
Henry, you briefly threw in Jack Welch's name on the ground looking up into a machine, which I'm sure he did. And I think that in GE there are a lot of things that go on that are similar to what we're talking about here. So, on the other hand, GE is one of the most analytical, process-driven, MBA-ish companies in the world. So can you talk about that paradox and how they come together?
Yeah, and Debbie was working in GE when workout was a big thing and all those things. So Welch himself was not like, Welch was analytical in the sense he had a PhD in chemical engineering, but he had no MBA. In fact, there was a poll some years ago among MBAs of who were the most admired chief executives in America. None of the top 5 had MBAs. And Welch was one of those, obviously, at that point. So, it's interesting. We call the second module of the IMPM the analytic mindset, and it's about organizations. Because a lot of what goes on in organizations is necessarily analytical, to go back to the last question. It's necessarily analytical. I mean, you've got to be structured, you've got to be organized, you've got to do things in a certain way. But I would argue, and I would guess you'd agree, that Welch wasn't managing that way. Welch was, the story I like, and this was from Bowman, we talked about Bowman yesterday directly, where he crawled under a machine because there was a problem, and the division manager, or the light bulb division, kept saying, we're solving it, and Welch flew to the machine, not the division headquarters, crawled under the machine and found out that he could get software people in the aircraft engine division to solve that problem. So he did it himself. That doesn't mean Welch should solve all those problems. It means that if you want to manage in GE, get under the damn machine and see what's going on. And so Welch's own style, in a way, Welch had other problems we talked about yesterday anyway, but Welch's own style, I think, was very much that. And GE has been brilliant at training managers. Incredible record. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, so let's start the coaching ourselves topic. And we'll see what the timing is. Yesterday, somebody was saying we want to double the time of all these coaching ourselves topics, because when we use them, we need twice as much time in Denmark. And we were thinking, and in Italy, you probably need 4 times as much time, because everybody wants to talk about everything all the time. So, but anyway, try and stick for today.
So
the instructions are on the